Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the discussion on Moll Flanders as a social text. Now, in today's discussion, we'll try to present a conclusive discussion on the text itself, and I would, or rather, we would try to look at Moll Flanders as a social as well as a feminist text. So, first of all, that Moll Flanders was published in 1722, that is, immediately after Robinson Crusoe, and by the time Defoe has already been an established novelist because of the extreme popularity of the Robinson Crusoe. Now, Moll Flanders, it further contributed to the popularity of Daniel Defoe as a novelist because Moll Flanders, it became a bestseller, and also it, even in today, it enjoyed popularity as a classic and at the same time as a popular reading, popular to the common reading public. Now, when we look at the particular issue of the sociological issues represented in Moll Flanders, and first of all, we need to look at the fact that Moll Flanders, although it acquired huge popularity soon after its publication, but Moll Flanders, it generated mixed response among the critics immediately after its publication, and that sort of variety or multiplicity of responses, observations that we come across in the subsequent criticism, both in the contemporary as well as in the subsequent criticism of the text. We find the variety of opinions and often contradictory opinions. Now, what are the sociological issues? Number one, that primarily Moll Flanders is a picaresque novel. That is, the novel dealing with a rogue or picaro, a criminal. Now, as we have gathered from the preface to Moll Flanders, that Defoe was mostly careful to provide the novel the dimension of a non-fiction. That is, he was very careful, and he almost rather took up utmost care to present the novel as an authentic account of the contemporary England and contemporary United States. So that was the primary intention of Daniel Defoe, and he wants to make it very clear that I am going to write a truthful account of the life of Moll Flanders. So Moll Flanders, the name might be fictitious, seems to have represented the life of the criminal life of a criminal in 18th century England, as far as the very activities, the very life, this nature of the sentence which was delivered to her, and this imprisonment, the prosecution, imprisonment, release, everything was pretty realistic. And above all, what appears to be the most realistic aspect of the novel is the her life as a cut purse, as a criminal, as a thief, and as a prostitute. So in that particular section of the novel, we come across a realistic representation of the contemporary British England, contemporary London underworld. And the same underworld we come across in Dickens later on, and even before that, in Defoe, we find a realistic portrait of the London underworld, and which happens to be even closer to reality than that of Dickens. So, first of all, this novel is a picaresque novel, and as Defoe has categorically and explicitly mentioned in the preface, this novel is based on the realistic event, because we have to remember that Defoe had this particular trend of writing on the issues of investigating journalism. So this practice of investigating journalism that also got reflected in the very narrative strategy which Defoe has employed in Moll Flanders, number one. Number two is that regarding this very structure of the novel, also there are different critical opinions that is it really a novel, or does the structure suffice for a particular, suffice to be qualified as a perfectly well knit narrative structure. Now that question we need to address, because we find that somehow there are, if we look at this narrative structure of Moll Flanders from the modernist or from the contemporary perspective, from the perspective of the contemporary criticism, then we find that there are certain narrative flaws in the very structure of the novel and also in the representation of character. For example, there is something which is observed by the critics, that for Moll Flanders, Defoe's sympathy for Moll exceeds the awareness of reality. The Defoe is very much sympathetic, or rather we can say that might be, if it's not an overstatement, that might be biased towards Moll Flanders, rather than to create an awareness about reality. But we have to understand that after all, Defoe is writing a novel and not a journalistic report, not as a journalistic correspondence. So in that case, the authorial sympathy or the authorial intention, it cannot be completely denied. So in that case, there is some kind of criticism about the structure and of the novel and representation of the characters. For example, Harold Bloom says that the readers did not understand Moll because Defoe himself did not understand Moll properly. That is one of the observations by Harold Bloom. And regarding this very representation of reality or its manifestation of social issues, now we have to look at the very contemporary sociological condition of 18th century England. Now what is the contemporary sociological condition? The condition was that if we look at the very contemporary popular taste of London and the British cities in the 18th century, we find that by 1720, crime became the most popular and the most chosen subject for reading and discussion among the British aristocrats, the British bourgeois, and the British petty bourgeois public. And mostly, as we have already discussed, historically the form novel evolved as a product, a byproduct of the byproduct to cater the needs of the petty bourgeois class, who were newly educated and also uh, who have the women and men, mostly the women, have got enough time to read fictions at home. So because middle class audience, they were the primary subscriber or subscribers of the novel form. So no wonder that novel as a literary form is primarily catering to their taste, and therefore crime, it emerged or it appeared to be the uh, recurrent motif or this recurrent center of discussion in 18th century fiction. So the novel, it actually explores the three important popular issues. One is the theft or crime, number two, its punishment, and number three, prostitution. So, criminal activity, prostitution, punishment. Now, these three are the sociological as well as the moral issues in the 18th century England. So, what we find that by dealing with these three issues, Moll Flanders not only manifests but at the same time problematizes the very concept of crime and punishment. Now, how did he problematize? Now, when we look at the very actions of Moll Flanders, that whatever she has done, I mean, theft, prostitution, having multiple partners, sort of forgery, all these things that she were involved. Now, there are two primary aspects or two primary perspectives through which her actions could have been seen. Now, what are the perspectives? Number one, that her actions could have been considered as ambitious acts, because what is the primary motive as well as the primary instrument or the primary catalyst or the driving force which drives the action of the novel, action of the narrative. What actually sort of what was drawing the narrative towards its end. Now, this driving force or this catalyst in the novel is primarily the money. The money is the important factor. Now, what was important that this one perspective is that Moll Flanders is running after money because her primary problem was that she wishes to be a lady. She wishes to uplift her social position. Now, this particular trend we come across in other female protagonists in 18th and 19th century novels. For example, when we look at Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, we find that Elizabeth Bennet, in this very change of perspective in the mind of Elizabeth Bennet about Fitzwilliam Darcy, that when she visited Darcy's estate, so what she actually sort of meditated on, what she pondered upon, that it would be wonderful to be the mistress of this house. That was the idea which, we sort of come across in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, similar intention we come across in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Burton. So all these novels, heroines, they had the desire to uplift their social position, to elevate their social position, to become the lady, to become the aristocratic mistress. So there is no harm in that. There is absolutely no harm in that. But what is the problem is that Moll Flanders, in order to in order to achieve her desire, she resorted to things which are quote unquote immoral. That is one perspective. That is, primary problem is that she deviated from the path of Christianity, Christian morality. That is the one of the principal accusations against Moll Flanders. Now, what actually problematizes her action? That actually which problematizes the very sort of interpretation of the novel as a morality text is that Moll Flanders undoubtedly has committed crimes, but she has committed these crimes for survival, because when she was rejected by her husbands, when she was compelled to leave their husbands, when she was sort of deceived by people in the name of love, when she was seduced, when she was exploited, when she was rejected, so she had no other option but to survive by any means. And what is the thing is that she seems to be very pragmatic in that sense, unlike the Victorian female protagonists. For example, in Mary Burton, there is a character, Esther, who left with a person. She left her house with a person in order to avoid hunger in the time of extreme poverty and extreme poverty, hunger, and epidemic. That was a time in Victorian England when Esther had to flee. But the thing is that she was forgiven by Elizabeth Gaskell only when she came back as a repentant woman. So what was important is that her act for survival was not forgiven, although it was meant principally for a survival, but she was not forgiven until she came back as a repentant lady. So what became important for this so-called moralistic writers of the Victorian period, that they were more concerned with morality rather than the very pragmatic needs of everyday life. Defoe was not like that. Defoe appears to be very pragmatic in his approach, and he wanted Moll Flanders to do whatever suits her needs. I would like to quote from a section from the novel. Just wait a minute. I'll just quote. Yes. Now, when the brothers are discussing Moll near the beginning of the novel, what they say about Moll Flanders. Betty, I quote from the text, Betty wants but one thing, but she had as good want everything, for the market is against our sex just now. And if a young woman have beauty, birth, breeding, wit, sense, manners, modesty, and all these to an extreme. Yet, if she have not money, she is nobody. She has would want them all, for nothing but money now recommends a woman. The men play the game all into their hands. So, because the women have everything, they have beauty, they have wit, they have responsibility, they have good sense. But what actually kept them behind men, what actually made them pawns in the hands of men, that is the only thing, that the men were the sole possessors of money. So what Moll Flanders did was just to interrogate and to challenge and this subvert this very rigidly, specifically male domain. What is the male domain? Wealth. That the men should have the sole control over money, over wealth, over property. Now, such patriarchal notions, such patriarchal supremacy, such monopoly of men over money was challenged by Moll Flanders. So that is why she tries to be the sole possessor of money in order to challenge the male supremacy. So if we look at Moll Flanders as a feminist text, the primary question was that this Moll Flanders, in her effort to possess wealth, property and money, tried to enter, tried to intrude, or tried to deconstruct the conservative male monopoly over money, wealth and property. And that particular effort, that particular attempt was actually in consonance, was actually in parity with the primary demands raised by the equity feminists, that is the first wave feminists in the first half of the 20th century. For example, like Virginia Woolf in A Room of One's Own. Now, what we find in this text, that Moll Flanders, she tried to play multiple roles in the text. For example, she has played the role of orphan, the role of servant, role of thief, role of prostitute, criminal, as well as wife and mother. Now this particular novel, so she has played multiple roles, and in this particular novel, if you look at carefully, it has been divided into two principal sections. The first section consists of Moll Flanders' upbringing, Moll Flanders' childhood, her adolescence, and her primary role to become the wife of the younger brother of her first love. So that part shows that how perfectly, how well she has performed her duties as the mother, as the wife in the domestic sphere. So if we say that Moll Flanders fits the role of thief, prostitute, criminal, but could not really perform the role of the mother, role of the wife, that would be an understatement, I'd say. Now, finally, so in the final part of the discussion, what we actually have to look at, the fact that what is primarily the needs, I mean primarily the reasons for the wide popularity of Moll Flanders. There's a sort of sort of uh, final sort of concluding observations on Moll Flanders. That's number one is that the Moll Flanders was a hugely popular novel. It was a bestseller in 18th century when it was published, because Defoe was very aware of the very preferences and demands of the marketplace. The Daniel Defoe, he was often categorized as a very shrewd writer, is a very sort of conscious, very shrewd, and very intelligent. And even Marx and Engels, they did not like Daniel Defoe much, and Marx considered him more as a bourgeois sort of writer. But it's true, but he's like, he had this bourgeois sentiment, because he understands very well the very sensations, or the very demands and tastes and needs of the contemporary market. So because of this drawing on a subject of a very popular interest, the novel has achieved huge commercial success. Now, but what is really important for its appeal even today? Now it's been canonized, included in the syllabus, and still we are reading this text. So because of this pioneering act of subversion, that where a woman is trying to enter, trying to invade the domain of man unapologetic. It's very important. That Moll Flanders was very pragmatic. She did not apologize, except at that later part. This penance and things, these are some of the demands of the market that Defoe had to respond to. But Moll Flanders, she remained unapologetic. And by responding to what she wants rather than what the society wants her to be, or what the society wants her to do, she remains one of the pioneering characters, one of the pioneering, inspiring characters in the whole domain of fiction, which deal with the issue of feminism, issues of identity, rights, and necessities of the women. I hope that this is a conclusive discussion, and we have tried to include and try to look at the issues which are there in the novel. So thank you very much for your patient hearing. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your cooperation. Thank you so much.